I lived here during the first 2 years of high school. I lived with my grandparents and went to Wilson. And it was wonderful. In the first month of school, you could come home from school and walk home on Sunset and come down the driveway and then turn and come down through here. And for about 6 or 8 weeks, there was this steady progression of fruit coming right. Different plums and then different prunes and then the apples and pears and all the way back to the house.
I was first kind of aware of the Dosch Estate because I'm on the Heritage Tree Committee. And in looking at the heritage trees that we had in Portland, I noticed that there were all of these. There's 8 trees on this one property. We had a very short little note that they are on the property of this man, Henry Dosch.
Henry and Mary met in Canyon City in 1863 or 4 or 5 during the gold rush there, and married and lived there until 1870 when the fire came through Canyon City and burned the place out and burned them out. That's when they came to Portland. And again, I don't know this, but I'm guessing that at some point after they got this place and started working on it, that Henry acquired the ponderosa pines from eastern Oregon and brought them and planted them.
When we're talking about the history of the Pacific Northwest, it's easy to say that the written record starts with Lewis and Clark in 1805 with their explorations here, but that really misses something, a very rich and varied history of indigenous peoples who left written records. They're just a type of written record that people from a European background aren't familiar with. The artifacts of their existence are still there today. You can see a big Oregon white oak. It's a great example of their work. They had managed that land for thousands of years and kind of built an agricultural economy in the Willamette Valley that often is overlooked by historians. It's not often that you can see a chronology like this. For several hundred years, individual people have made a lasting difference. They've kind of, whether they knew it or not, they've been part of a legacy of stewardship. And that's what I think is really important about this story.
But I have an impression that Albert Kelly, when he came over the hill in 1847, left those trees there when he cleared this property.
He saw several of these large oak trees that those Kalapuya Tualatin Indians had managed and saw something of value in them. He actually built his cabin right next to them underneath the oaks. The areas that he did clear, he went right ahead and planted new trees.
And of course, when Henry bought the place, one of his primary reasons for buying the 17 acres in here was Kelly's orchard. That's what he was buying. That was the thing that drew him to this property. And so when Henry and Mary came along, here are these 3, full-grown oak trees. Gives lovely shade, and for whatever reason, they charmed Henry because, as you say, he called this house Villa Eichenhof, House of the Oaks. When he retired from business, he took up horticulture as a hobby, almost as a business, and he brought a lot of the trees in and planted them here on the property. The chestnut trees, the walnut trees, the various plums and prunes that he brought in, that little Japanese cedar down in front of the house that we think he brought back from Japan in 1903. All those trees had some relation to Oregon, the history of Oregon's developing those industries.
What he's most noted for is his experiments with walnuts. He would take these experiments and he would publish papers on them. And that kind of launched him in this whole new world where the state of Oregon realized that this guy had a real interest in promoting Oregon agriculture. He did all that work up at Villa Eichenhof, and it's through that work that he was appointed to the Oregon State Board of Horticulture.
And of course, he became the first secretary of the Oregon State Board of Horticulture after it was established, and he served in that position for like 25 years. They wrote pamphlets and sent them to farmers. Here's how you plant a tree and make it work in Oregon. of Western Oregon. Here are the varieties, here's some, and there's all this writing, and Henry was the guy who basically, was in charge of all those publications. This property had served in a way as a kind of an experimental horticultural research station for the state of Oregon for about 20 or 25 years, and the results of that was all over here.
The property today is owned by Jim Driscoll, who is the great-grandson of Henry Dosch. So he grew up spending time with his grandparents on the property. And in many of the photos that I have from Multnomah County archives, his grandparents are the children in the photos. I think it really shows that this history is not that old.
My grandmother had lived here really the last 10 or 15 years of her life pretty much by herself, and she had very few resources, and things just didn't get fixed. And the roof was going, and the house needed a lot of work. But I had grown up here. I'd been here, coming here since I was, 2 or 3 years old. And I had all these memories. I'd grown up listening to my grandmother's stories about her parents and her brothers and sisters and life here and the people they'd entertained over the years and things. And it just seemed a shame not to make an effort to keep it. Most of the people who looked at it from a business standpoint all felt that the old house should be pushed in a pile and burned because you could build 3 houses where it sits. But my grandmother was determined that wasn't going to happen, and she eventually agreed to sell the property to me on the condition that I preserve the house.
Through Jim's development plan, he was able to be both a preservationist and also be forward-thinking.
They designed a development that had 27 lots instead of the 44 we could have put in here, and the narrow road that comes down through so that you could work it down through the trees and not have to take out all the big trees. The bellflower apple tree out there, we wound up putting a turnaround around it precisely so that you could drive around it and you didn't have to take it out to drive through it. Subsequently, the state and the historians determined that that was the oldest bearing standard grafted apple tree in the western United States, and it's out there and it still bears apples, and it's so those things were worth hanging on to and trying to preserve it. It's just a little bit of extra time and thought to figure out a way to do a development without destroying what's already here.
For me, the most important thing about this story is that it gives us an example of how to preserve something over time. For several hundred years, individual people have made a lasting difference. Whether they knew it or not, they've been part of a legacy of stewardship. And that's what I think is really important about this story.